Ladies and gentlemen, you are not ready for this.
ਨਾ ਦੇ ਦਿਲ ਪਰਦੇਸੀ ਨੂੰ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਨਿਤ ਦਾ ਰੋਣਾ ਪੈ ਜਾਊਗਾ ਨਾ ਦੇ ਦਿਲ ਪਰਦੇਸੀ ਨੂੰ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਨਿਤ ਦਾ ਰੋਣਾ ਪੈ ਜਾਊਗਾ ਨਾਲ ਰਜੇ ਤੇ ਜੋਗੀ ਦੇ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਜੋਗਣ ਹੋਣਾ ਪੈ ਜਾਊਗਾ
Get ready.
I'm a king, but I bop, I'm a saint. They call me a bad man, that's a fucking good thing. Mama said swing back when another man swings, so I make my mama proud and they make their heads ring. Father forgive me, I can't forgive them. You know my history, know what I did then. And what I do now, a whole lot worse. Heavy is the head, it's a blessing and a curse.
ਪਰਦੇਸੀ ਨੂੰ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਨਿਤ ਦਾ ਰੋਣਾ ਪੈ ਜਾਊਗਾ ਨਾਲ ਰਜੇ ਤੇ ਜੋਗੀ ਦੇ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਜੋਗਣ ਹੋਣਾ ਪੈ ਜਾਊਗਾ
I'm a saint, they call me a bad man, that's a good thing. Mama said swing back when another man swings, so I make my mama proud and they make their heads ring. Heavy is the head, heavy is the head, heavy is the head, it's a blessing and a curse. Heavy is the head, heavy is the head, heavy is the head, I'ma make it work. Heavy is the head, heavy is the head, heavy is the head, hit 'em where it hurts.
One U.S. sergeant later wrote in his diary, "We didn't take Berlin. We found its shadow." In those final days, as the Soviets encircled the city from the east and south, small pockets of German resistance tried to flee westward, toward the Americans. Bridges over the Elbe became the last lifelines of survival. Soldiers, civilians, and even SS officers crossed the river with hands raised, preferring captivity under the stars of America to death under the hammer and sickle. And then, as April turned toward its final week, the impossible happened. American patrols, following confused orders and fleeing enemies, stepped onto the western edges of Berlin's administrative boundary. They didn't come to conquer. They came to witness, and what they saw defied everything they had imagined. A city where the idea of victory had long since vanished, and where even the most loyal defenders of the Reich could no longer believe what stood before them. The human angle for the men of the U.S. Army, the final weeks of the war were filled with contradictions, triumph and exhaustion, justice and disbelief. They had fought across continents, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the freezing forests of the Ardennes, and now stood in the land of the enemy. Not a battlefield anymore, but a graveyard of an empire. In towns west of Berlin, soldiers found streets littered with rifles and helmets, doors painted with white crosses to signal surrender, and civilians emerging from cellars with eyes hollowed by hunger and fear. The war that had begun with Hitler's roar was ending in whispers. To many, the sight was unsettling. These were not defiant enemies anymore. They were broken people. A private from the 83rd Infantry wrote home, "We came looking for Nazis. What we found were widows, orphans, and ruins." Berlin, though just ahead, had become more symbol than destination. Men spoke of it in low voices, unsure whether they wanted to see the heart of what had caused so much death. Rumors spread that the Soviets were already inside the city, that Hitler was dead, or that he was waiting to make a final stand. No one knew what was true. Yet the closer they got, the more surreal it became. They passed factories where forced laborers were still chained in workshops. They saw railway cars filled with corpses near Magdeburg and Buchenwald. Every mile deeper into Germany stripped away another layer of illusion. until the soldiers realized that victory could never feel pure. War correspondents writing with the columns described the faces of the men. Calm, alert, expressionless, not the faces of conquerors but of witnesses. They no longer fought for ground or glory, only to see the end, to make sure this nightmare truly ended. When they reached the outskirts of Berlin, some carried cameras, others pocket-sized notebooks. What they saw, destroyed suburbs, abandoned SS posts, civilians waving white sheets, left them silent. One officer recalled that no one cheered. The war was ending not with fanfare, but with the quiet collapse of everything that had once seemed unshakable. And the tactical angle behind the calm faces of the soldiers lay a strategy as deliberate as it was controversial. When Eisenhower decided to stop the Allied advance at the Elbe River, the decision sparked heated debate across every headquarters from London to Washington. To some, it looked like surrendering the political heart of Europe to Stalin. To others, it was the only rational choice in a war that had already cost tens of millions of lives. The facts were cold. The German army in the West was finished. The Ruhr pocket had collapsed, yielding over 300,000 prisoners. Bridges over the Rhine had been seized in daring operations, including the legendary crossing at Remagen. American and British divisions were now spread wide across Germany, stretched thin by occupation duties and logistical exhaustion. Berlin, by contrast, was a fortress. Soviet reconnaissance flights showed more than 1 million defenders inside the capital and its surrounding defenses. SS divisions, Hitler Youth battalions, and remnants of the Wehrmacht. Every street, intersection, and subway station had been prepared for urban warfare. The British and Americans had already seen what that meant. In Aachen, Cologne, and the ruins of Metz. Street fighting in Berlin would have been a catastrophe. Tanks would bog down, infantry would face snipers in every window, and civilians would be caught in the crossfire. For Eisenhower, the choice was clear. The Allies would secure central and southern Germany, eliminate remaining resistance, and prevent any Nazi retreat into the Alps. Berlin could fall to the Soviets. The war would still end, and the killing would stop sooner. Still, the tactical restraint felt hollow to many on the front lines. They had fought too far, lost too many to stop just short of the enemy's capital. But soldiers obey orders, and so the U.S. Army waited on the Elbe's western banks, watching the glow of artillery from the Soviet bombardment flicker on the horizon. From a tactical standpoint, the plan worked perfectly. By avoiding the Berlin operation, the Allies saved thousands of lives, secured nearly all of Western Germany, and positioned themselves for post-war occupation. Yet historically, it marked the first visible fault line of the coming Cold War. Eisenhower's coordination with Stalin, through cables exchanged between chief headquarters and the Kremlin, was courteous but cautious. Each side knew that cooperation would end the day the guns fell silent. Berlin, already divided on paper, was destined to be split in concrete and barbed wire within a few years. And so, as American patrols stood near the border of the burning capital, the war's tactical brilliance met its human melancholy. The soldiers who could have taken Berlin now watched it fall in flames, not by their hands, but before their eyes. The silence of that moment said more than any victory parade ever could. By 1945, the Allied war effort had evolved into something the Axis could no longer comprehend. The technological superiority that had once been gradual was now absolute. American industry had turned warfare into an exact science. From the sky to the ground, every element of combat was synchronized by machines, mathematics, and logistics. The result was not just power, it was inevitability. When the U.S. Army advanced into central Germany, it did so behind an unbroken line of mechanical precision. Convoys of GMC trucks rolled like arteries of steel across the countryside, carrying everything from fuel and ammunition to field hospitals and communication posts. Bridges destroyed by retreating Germans were rebuilt in hours using Bailey bridge systems, modular structures that could be deployed overnight by combat engineers. Overhead, Allied air power reigned without challenge. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang ruled the skies, cutting off supply columns, strafing trains, and silencing any last attempt at resistance. Bombers such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator had already reduced Germany's industrial core to rubble. By April, there were few targets left standing. To the soldiers, the war had become a rhythm of relentless movement, a flow of engines, armor, and radio transmissions. The M4 Sherman, though often criticized, remained the backbone of this advance. It was not superior in armor or gunpowder to the German Tiger or Panther, but it was simple, reliable, and everywhere. For every German tank destroyed, 5 more Shermans would take its place. Behind this force, the Signal Corps orchestrated communication across hundreds of miles using portable radio networks. Commanders could coordinate airstrikes and artillery fire with precision unheard of in the early war years. The result was a seamless engine of destruction, fast, adaptable, and self-sustaining. The contrast with the collapsing German forces was devastating. The Wehrmacht's armored divisions were immobilized by fuel shortages. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. And deep inside Berlin, Hitler's last so-called wonder weapon, the V-2 rockets, were irrelevant to the battle for survival. Technological might had become moral inevitability. When American soldiers reached Berlin's outskirts, they were not merely soldiers of a nation. They were the living proof that industrial democracy could outbuild and outlast tyranny. The Reich, founded on ideology, had been undone by engineering. The enemy perspective. For the SS, the sight of American vehicles near Berlin was incomprehensible. Propaganda had promised them that the Western Allies would never dare to enter the heart of the Reich. They were told that Hitler's miracle weapons would reverse the tide, that the Führer still commanded armies capable of defending the capital. But when the U.S. columns appeared west of Potsdam, moving methodically through shattered villages, many SS men simply froze. Their maps no longer matched reality. Their commanders had vanished, communications were gone, and the Luftwaffe no longer patrolled the skies. Those who had once sworn loyalty unto death now faced a truth more terrifying than the enemy and the realization that everything they had believed in was a lie. In the final days of April, as Soviet artillery hammered the city from the east, SS units still stationed west of Berlin tried to flee toward the American lines. They knew what awaited them if captured by the Red Army: summary execution or vengeance in kind for years of atrocities. Some fought small skirmishes to break through the chaos. Others surrendered outright, discarding their insignia in ditches and mud. When American patrols encountered them, the moment was surreal. Men wearing the black uniforms of the Waffen-SS, once symbols of ruthless power, approached with hands raised, faces pale, voices trembling in English, French, or broken German. They were not defiant. They were desperate. One U.S. lieutenant from the 69th Infantry Division later recalled that the SS prisoners looked at us like men seeing ghosts. To them, the idea that Americans, not Soviets, had reached the gates of Berlin was unthinkable. Their world had been built on myths of superiority and destiny, and now both lay buried beneath the rubble of their capital. In some cases, SS officers refused to surrender at all. A few small groups chose suicide, convinced that capture would mean humiliation. Others tried to disguise themselves among civilians or regular Wehrmacht soldiers, but their discipline betrayed them. Even stripped of insignia, their bearing, their boots, their silence, all revealed who they were. American soldiers, though hardened by years of war, felt a mix of anger and disbelief. These were the men who had overseen massacres in France, the ones who had executed prisoners, who had burned villages. And now in the ashes of their empire they stood powerless, waiting for mercy. Yet remarkably order prevailed. The Americans took them prisoner under the same conventions that governed all combatants. The Geneva Code was still honored, even as the enemy's moral fabric had collapsed. For many it was the first glimpse of a world governed by law, not fear. In that moment, and between surrender and silence, the psychological war ended. The SS had believed themselves the embodiment of an eternal Reich, but as they looked at the olive-drab uniforms of the Americans, they saw the truth written in dust and smoke. Their empire had lasted 12 years, not 1,000, and for the first time, the symbols of terror trembled before the soldiers of freedom. April 25, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final hours. Across central Germany, the thunder of artillery had become a constant rolling echo. The sky above Berlin was a gray haze of smoke, dust, and drifting ash. From the western approaches, through the forests and lakes of Brandenburg, American patrols advanced with cautious precision, not knowing whether they would meet surrender or fire. The city before them no longer looked like a capital. The suburbs of Wannsee, Zehlendorf, and Potsdam were in ruins. Streets cratered, bridges collapsed, villas reduced to splinters. The once proud avenues of Greater Berlin were now unrecognizable beneath the scars of air raids. In every direction, fires burned unchecked. The soldiers who entered these outer districts did so almost in disbelief. Their orders were to hold positions west of the Elbe and avoid direct engagement with Soviet forces already closing in from the east. But in the chaos of retreat and surrender, front lines had dissolved. The Americans were no longer just at the gates of Berlin. In places, they had crossed into it. A reconnaissance platoon from the 83rd Infantry Division pushed into the western administrative boundary near Stahnsdorf. They found no organized resistance, only scattered gunfire echoing somewhere deep inside the city. The enemy had evaporated. Corporal James Holbrook, one of the first Americans to set foot on the road marked Berlin, later wrote, "We expected to fight. We expected the SS to come at us from every doorway. Instead, we found silence. A whole world gone quiet. That silence was deceptive. Beneath it lay the sound of collapse, the shuffling of refugees, the distant crack of Soviet artillery, the occasional burst of panic as civilians tried to flee one last time. In every direction, the war had turned inward. Civilians emerged from cellars clutching white rags or handkerchiefs, their faces gray with dust and disbelief. They had been told that American soldiers were monsters. Instead, they found young men who offered water, cigarettes, and, for the first time in years, a sense of safety. But not everyone surrendered so easily. Scattered SS detachments still roamed the area, refusing to accept defeat. Some hid in farmhouses or abandoned villas, hoping to ambush or delay the inevitable. Others tried to reach the American lines to escape capture by the Soviets. In one instance near Potsdam, a small group of Waffen-SS officers approached an American checkpoint waving a white flag, their uniforms stripped of insignia. The patrol accepted their surrender in silence. The same men who had once ruled by terror were now prisoners of the very freedom they had tried to destroy. Behind the American lines, field commanders were acutely aware of the fragile situation. Orders were strict. No further advance toward the city center. The Soviets were less than 10 miles away, already encircling Berlin from the east. Any accidental encounter could spark a political disaster, and yet the soldiers could not ignore what they saw. Every mile closer to Berlin revealed more devastation. Burned-out tanks, shattered artillery, civilians searching the rubble for food. Horses pulled wagons filled with the wounded. The roads were lined with crosses, hastily marked graves of both German and Allied dead. By the evening of April 25th, the air carried the faint vibration of Soviet shellfire. The ground itself trembled. The Americans could see the red glow of explosions reflecting against the clouds. Somewhere in that inferno, the Reich was dying. That same day, in the corridors of Allied command, messages flashed across Europe. The U.S. First Army had reached the Elbe River at Torgau, and there, on a wooden bridge over the water, American and Soviet soldiers met face to face. The moment was captured in photographs. Lieutenant William Robertson of the 69th Infantry Division, extending his hand to Lieutenant Alexei Silvashko of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division. Two men from opposite worlds united by exhaustion and victory. The Elbe Day handshake became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century, a symbol that Nazi Germany had been split in two, its armies trapped, its capital surrounded. But for the men standing west of Berlin, the feeling was not triumph. It was something deeper, a kind of solemn awe. They were witnessing the fall of a civilization built on lies. As night fell, American soldiers bivouacked among the ruins. The fires of Berlin flickered on the horizon like a dying sun. Over distant gunfire, someone tuned a field radio. News came in fragments. Hitler was rumored dead. The Red Army was inside the Reichstag. The war might end within days. In one foxhole near Potsdam, a young sergeant wrote in his notebook, "We came all this way to see the heart of the enemy. It isn't a city anymore. It's a warning." The next morning, as reconnaissance aircraft passed overhead, the scale of destruction became clear. From above, Berlin looked less like a capital and more like a wound in the earth. Block after block of rubble, streets erased, the Spree River running through smoke. For years, the city had been the center of fear, power, and ideology. Now it was a mausoleum, and in that silence, something irreversible had happened. The world had changed hands. Inside Berlin, the war had already become a siege of ghosts. By the final week of April 1945, the once mighty Reich was confined to a few shattered city blocks surrounding the Führer bunker. The Red Army was closing in from every direction, their artillery pounding the city center day and night, reducing entire districts to dust. Bridges over the Spree had collapsed, subway tunnels were flooded, and communication lines were dead. Yet, in that chaos, Hitler's command bunker remained a dark island of denial. Underground, beneath the Chancellery gardens, the Führer gave orders to armies that no longer existed. Divisions destroyed, generals dead or captured, fronts that existed only on paper. The map before him was a mirage. Witnesses later recalled the air thick with smoke and despair. The smell of burning fuel mixed with sweat and damp concrete. The sound of Soviet shells above was so constant that even conversation became meaningless. Secretaries wept silently. Officers argued over who would attempt to break through the encirclement. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the walls. Outside, the city itself had become unrecognizable. Children, the last remnants of the Hitler youth, now fought with Panzerfaust from street corners. Old men in makeshift uniforms defended intersections with ancient rifles. Civilians hid in basements as entire neighborhoods vanished beneath artillery fire. By April 28th, the Soviets had captured Tempelhof Airport. The German high command was cut off. The last radio messages sent from the bunker were desperate. Calls for non-existent reinforcements, appeals to generals who had already surrendered. Then came the news that sealed the regime's fate. Mussolini had been executed. His body hung in Milan for the world to see. The message was clear. There would be no rescue, no redemption, no escape. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, with the Soviets less than 500 meters from the Chancellery, Hitler made his final decision. He emerged briefly from his quarters, shook hands with his staff, and retreated to his private room. Moments later, a muffled shot echoed through the corridors. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich had ruled for only 12. Above ground, Soviet troops stormed through the ruins of central Berlin. The red banner was raised over the Reichstag, not as a flag of triumph, but as a scar on the heart of a nation that had burned itself to ashes. When word of Hitler's death reached the outside world, it spread like an electrical current through the Allied lines. American soldiers west of the Elbe heard it over field radios in fragments. Hitler is dead. Repeat, Hitler is dead. There was no cheering, no celebration, only silence. The men looked at one another and realized the same thing. The war that had defined their lives was ending, not with victory parades, but with exhaustion. In the following days, what remained of the German government crumbled. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's chosen successor, broadcast a final address from Flensburg, pleading for the Western Allies to continue fighting the Soviets. But it was already over. The Third Reich no longer existed. On May 7, 1945, inside a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, representatives of the German High Command signed the unconditional surrender of all forces. General Alfred Jodl signed on behalf of Germany. General Walter Bedell Smith signed for the Allies, and Soviet General Ivan Susloparov for the Red Army. It was done. The war in Europe, the most devastating conflict in human history, had officially ended. When the news reached Berlin the next morning, the guns finally went silent. The Red Army had captured what remained of the city. Soviet soldiers stood among the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, staring at the bunker that had once been the center of the world's destruction. Photographs from those days show faces that seem older than their years. Soldiers covered in dust, civilians emerging from cellars, children too small to understand the world that had ended above them. The air was thick with smoke and disbelief. In one haunting image, a Soviet soldier leans against a crumbling statue of Germania, the mother figure of the Reich, her stone face cracked and blackened by fire. Around her feet lies the wreckage of the empire she symbolized. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, American troops remained just outside the city limits, holding their positions. Orders from Eisenhower were clear. Berlin would belong to the Soviets. The Americans would not enter. But that decision did not dull the emotion of the moment. Across every division, soldiers paused, not in triumph, but in remembrance. For many, the faces of fallen comrades appeared in their minds. The beaches of Normandy, the hedgerows of France, the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Every mile had led to this silence. One U.S. officer wrote in his journal that night, "We can hear the Russians firing in celebration. The city glows red on the horizon. Somewhere in that ruin the war is finally over. I thought I'd feel relief, but all I feel is the weight of it." And perhaps that was the truest victory, not in conquest, but in survival. For Berlin, the nightmare had ended. For the world, a new one was about to begin, the uneasy peace of the Cold War. But for those who stood at the gates of the ruined capital in May 1945, one thought endured. They had come face to face with the price of ideology, the fragility of empires, and the haunting truth that even the mightiest city could fall to silence. Berlin did not fall in a single day. It collapsed over years, in decisions made far from its streets, in words that turned into orders, and in the silence of those who chose not to see what was coming. When the smoke cleared in May 1945, what remained was not a victory scene, but a graveyard of ambition. Entire city blocks were gone. Families searched through the rubble for names written on scraps of paper. The air carried a smell that lingered for weeks. Dust, fire, and endings. The Allies walked through the ruins quietly. Even the victors could not take pride in what they saw. The war had consumed everything, and cities, generations, and innocence itself. Historians would later call Berlin the symbolic funeral of the Second World War. Not just because the Reich had died there, but because it revealed the cost of modern power, the collision between ideology and humanity. Within months, the world that had united to destroy Nazi Germany began to fracture. The lines of occupation hardened into borders, and Berlin became the first battleground of a new kind of war. One fought not with tanks, but with suspicion. The Cold War was born from those ashes, but among the ruins, life slowly returned. Children played in the streets where tanks once burned. Music echoed from churches with broken roofs. Flags of peace fluttered where banners of hate had once hung. For the soldiers who stood at Berlin's gates, it was the end of one war and the beginning of memory. They had seen what blind faith and unchecked power could do. And perhaps in that moment, they understood that victory in war is never about conquest. It is about remembering what must never be repeated. Because the ruins of Berlin still whisper their warning. Empires fall. Cities burn. But the lessons, if we listen, endure.